We are officially in the 2025 offseason, so now let's dive into our Dynasty tight end rankings as we head into rookie draft season, starting off with Tier 1, which is only one guy. You guys know who it is. It is Brock Bowers. What Brock Bowers did this year was absolutely insane. 153 targets, 112 receptions, 1,200 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. He was 6th among all players, wide receivers included, wide receivers and tight ends, 6th in targets. He was 3rd in receptions. He was 8th in receiving yards. He was a fantasy wide receiver with a tight end designation. His only Achilles heel this year was really just touchdowns, which when you play in the Raiders offense, those are going to be hard to come by, but man, did he do his absolute best considering every single one of his scores came from outside the 10-yard line and 4 of his 5 touchdowns came outside the 20. Brock Bowers is just phenomenal. I mean, you are getting prime Travis Kelce out of essentially a 22-year-old rookie who still has so much more room to grow. I have no concerns about Bowers with any future quarterback. If he can do this with Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew, I have no concerns about them adding another wide receiver one because Bowers still paced for 120 targets and over 1,100 yards during the games that he played with Davante Adams. And mind you, those were also his first games of his NFL career. Nothing matters for Brock Bowers because he is elite, and we should just enjoy elite things. I would treat him no differently than I would Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase right now in Dynasty because that is essentially what you have at the tight end position. Now, similarly, Tier 2 is another simple tier of just one player, the other young guy for fantasy football in Trey McBride. I think some people would have McBride in Tier 1 with Brock Bowers. Honestly, really don't even have an issue with that if you think that way. I just think Brock Bowers is far and away the guy at the tight end position for fantasy and even on his own team. And what also separates Bowers from McBride is we know what McBride's main competition is for targets moving forward. It's Marvin Harrison Jr., who is still far and away better than almost anyone the Raiders could draft this year, especially if Ted McMillan is off the board before their pick. And if Marvin Harrison can figure it out, he might pull away more looks from McBride, and McBride's production might dip a little. Now, I'm not projecting that McBride is just going to lose a bunch of dynasty value and he's going to go down to being like Evan Engram if Marvin Harrison Jr. hits his ceiling, but it's also extremely possible that we just saw the best season of his career, at least in terms of receptions and yards. If he can actually start scoring touchdowns, that would be phenomenal for his fantasy value and can easily counteract a reduction in PPR points from receptions and yards, a la George Kittle in recent years compared to his very early career. Now, again, I don't want to sound like I hate Trey McBride or I think that he's overvalued for some reason. I definitely do not think any of that, and I would not advise selling Trey McBride either if you have him in Dynasty. All this was just a short explanation as to why McBride isn't in Tier 1 with Brock Bowers for me. Not at all why I would be out on McBride himself or why I think he's overvalued. He is phenomenal and rightfully deserves to be the Dynasty tight end 2 in his own tier. Tier 3 is a nice tier of 4 players now. It's TJ Hockenson, Mark Andrews, George Kittle, and Sam LaPorta. Hockenson does get the nod at the top of this tier because he feels like the most capable guy that can enter into that Tier 2 with Trey McBride still because he's not really old like George Kittle is currently or kind of like Mark Andrews is starting to be. And we've also seen TJ Hockenson in this Vikings offense be a PPR guy kind of like Trey McBride in Arizona. He averaged 14.5 PPR points per game in 2023, which would have been the tight end 4 on the year in 2024. He just got hurt at the end of the year. He tore his ACL, and that really affected his 2024 season. But hopefully, moving forward, TJ Hockenson can get back into being that reliable, elite weekly starter at the position with great volume and touchdown upside as well. Mark Andrews is next, which might surprise some people based on how his season started. But again, like TJ Hockenson, Andrews was coming off of an injury himself, an injury that I think we need to pay more attention to because it really affects players' production when they initially return to the field. Yes, weeks 1 through 5 for Andrews this year sucked. I never want to go back to that production ever again for him. But weeks 6 through 18, that was much more closer to vintage Mark Andrews. 14 PPR points per game as the tight end 6 overall. He put up double-digit points in 10 out of 12 games, including 15-plus points in 6 out of those 12 games. Now, a lot of that was on the back of touchdowns. He basically scored every single week, but he also paced for 800 receiving yards on 65 receptions, and that is good enough for me as he was still working his way back from injury. Was it a down season overall for Mark Andrews? Yes, but based on how he finished and his complete body of work for the past 5 to 6 years, I trust Andrew still as my dynasty tight end 4. Then we get to George Kittle, who actually had a career year this season with over 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns as his best overall statistical season since 2018. Now, a lot of that, I think, is because they didn't have Christian McCaffrey and they really didn't have Brandon Ayuk all year. So Kittle just became the de facto wide receiver 1 for this offense and the main red zone target 2 for the Niners to close out drives and score touchdowns. And because of that, I do think George Kittle is going to regress a bit across the board in 2025 with both Christian McCaffrey and Brandon Ayuk back. But that doesn't mean that Kittle is all of a sudden going to be bad. He had over 1,000 yards in 2023 with a really good Ayuk, with an elite Christian McCaffrey. He scored 11 touchdowns in 2022. He just basically did both of those things in one season this year. So Kittle is great and an elite option at the position still as my tight end 5. And then we get to Sam LaPorta, the youngest player in this entire tier. Now, earlier in the season, around about week 10 it was, I made a mid-season rankings update video that had Sam LaPorta at tight end 6 because he wasn't producing. Through those first 9 weeks of the year, he was the tight end 20 in points per game, and that was basically right when I made that rankings update video. Then, right after I posted the video, LaPorta regained some traction. He paced for over 900 yards and 11 touchdowns over the final 8 weeks of the season as the tight end 6 in points per game, right there with George Kittle and ahead of Travis Kelce. I will say though, LaPorta's main issue did continue last year while he returned to near top 5 production. A lot of it really depends on touchdowns. Through the first 9 weeks of the season, he averaged 3 receptions, 38 yards per game, and over the last 8 games, saw a slight bump up in usage. He had 4 receptions, 53 yards per game, so a nice 2.5 PPR points per game increase from just that, which was very nice to see. But the main difference between those two halves, 2 touchdowns in the first 9 weeks compared to 5 touchdowns in the last 8. He more than doubled his touchdown output. And that was the entire story of his whole rookie year too. He didn't produce a ton on receptions and yards like Bowers and Trey McBride did. He was under 900 receiving yards as a rookie, but he caught 10 touchdowns, and that production spiked him to the Dynasty tight end 1 overall prior to Brock Bowers getting drafted. But we know touchdowns are fluky, and when LaPorta is living and dying by these touchdowns, he's a little bit harder to trust on a weekly basis, especially when he's not a top option on his own offense behind Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams now after a breakout year, Jahmyr Gibbs, or just the Lions wanting to run 40 times a game in general. So I like Sam LaPorta a lot more than everyone else behind him, and his age definitely gives him plenty of time to grow into being a top 3 option again. It's just, as for right now, I don't trust him as much as I do everybody else above him. Now, tier 4 is rounding out basically the rest of the top 12 tight ends, guys that I'm very comfortable starting every week and could have consistent production as top 5 guys. They've all shown it in stretches, but overall, just not putting together massive seasons like everybody above them. First up is David Njoku, who continues to produce without Deshaun Watson, and now that Watson had surgery and his 2025 season is in jeopardy, which is actually kind of fantastic news for fantasy football, David Njoku should be a good option once again in 2025. And then we have Travis Kelce, who's just Travis Kelce. I mean, he may not be as elite as he once was, but he can absolutely still do it on any given week. You just can't rank Travis Kelce outside the top 8 until he decides to retire. He's that good. Then we have Jake Ferguson, who is the youngest player in this tier by far at only 25 years old, which kind of shocked me. I don't know why he feels like he should be older than that, but he is a reliable tight end who once again could be the second option on the Cowboys behind CeeDee Lamb in 2025, so I like him a lot at the middle of this tier. Then we get to Jonnu Smith, who had a career year in Miami, and I don't really see how that changes in 2025, especially if Tyreek Hill is no longer on the team. I would trust him now as a weekly starter, still with the Dolphins, maybe not to the level that he was for multiple weeks throughout this year, but a solid weekly option with the possibility for those spike week games. And then I still include Evan Engram in here for now, just because if he's on the Jaguars still in 2025, then he should be a solid weekly guy. But if he is a cap casualty and he does get cut, then we'll have to reevaluate depending on the team that he goes to. But again, for right now, tight end 11, I think, is fine for me at the end of this tier. And then tier 5 is basically the collection of guys that you can start every week because they feel like decent options, but you're also really not that content with these guys as your tight end 1 unless something really positive happens, like an injury ahead of them that kind of opens up the target share for them a little bit. So my order for this tier goes Dalton Kincaid, Tucker Kraft, Kyle Pitts, Dallas Goedert, Hunter Henry, and Pat Freiermuth. Kincaid and Kraft, I think, are the two guys in this tier that I need to explain as to why they're here and they're not higher, as both of these guys are actually top 7 tight ends on Keep Trade Cut. And the main reason why they're both down here is the same exact reason for both of them. Neither of them are good enough right now. That is really just the truth. We wanted Kincaid to have that breakout year without Stephon Diggs, but he was actually worse this year than he was as a rookie with Stephon Diggs. He averaged 7.8 PPR points per game as the tight end 20 overall and only had 3 games over double-digit points all season long. 3. You can't overvalue youth here when his production is really no better than like Tyler Conklin's or Will Dissly's. If you started Kincaid every week, you probably didn't make the playoffs and you probably weren't a serious contender. And the same thing is mostly true for Tucker Kraft, but at least he had a few more games over double-digit points than Dalton Kincaid. But really after his blow-up 25-point game in week 4, when everybody thought that he was entering a new tier of tight ends, he was just kind of meh after that. He averaged 9 PPR points per game from week 6 on, with as many games under 8 PPR points as he had over 10 PPR points. Pat Freiermuth had more points per game than Tucker Kraft from week 6 on, as did Hunter Henry, as did Zach Ertz. Kraft is a good tight end, just like Dalton Kincaid. Both these guys are good tight ends, but both guys are lost on their own teams because they're really not better talents than 2 to 3 other guys around them. So if I can't trust you every week, you don't deserve to be in the top 10, even if you are under 25 years old for Dynasty. Just ask Kyle Pitt managers how that's going for them to be valuing their sub 25-year-old inside the top 10 and not getting any production. Then as for tier 6 and 7, I'm just going to read them off and not dive into explanations for anyone individually. So tier 6 is everyone that you could basically start in a major pinch due to injuries or bye weeks, or maybe their production spikes because of injuries ahead of them. But essentially, you don't really want to be starting these guys every week. So for me, it goes Mike Gesicki, Dalton Schultz, Cade Otton, Isaiah Likely, Cole Kmet, and Chig Okonkwo. Then tier 7 is basically the very interesting first and second year guys in the league right now in Theo Johnson, JT Sanders, Brenton Strange, and Ben Sinnott. Oh, and if we were to include the top rookies in this class into these rankings as of right now in January, I would plug all 3 of the top guys, Tyler Warren, Harold Fannin, and Colston Loveland, in between tiers 3 and 4, really ultimately depending on draft capital and landing spot, but all 3 of them are really good prospects for fantasy, and I think could come in and initially vie for a top 5 Dynasty tight end ranking. So there is my current top 30 Dynasty tight end rankings with the top rookies included now that we're officially into the 2025 offseason. Make sure to drop any and all questions in the comments down below. Call me an idiot if you want, but either way, make sure you're subscribed for more Dynasty content for the rest of 2025.